I'm Trevor, and in this video, I compiled a list of terrifying Bigfoot encounters caught on camera. From a researcher whose years of careful camera preparation in the Washington wilderness leads to horrific Sasquatch footage, to a documentarian deep in the forest whose remote camera captures Bigfoot and a 350-pound black bear locked in a confrontation. I heard the first knock on a Tuesday night in late September 2013, and I knew immediately it wasn't a branch falling or a deer moving through the underbrush. I moved to the window, keeping the lights behind me dim, and I stared out into the darkness. I'd lived alone in this cabin for nearly 3 years since retiring from photography work that had taken me all over the country, and I'd grown accustomed to the sounds of the forest, the way animals moved and called to each other. But this felt different in a way I couldn't articulate even to myself. The knocking came again an hour later, closer this time, and I could hear the movement of something large pushing through the undergrowth. I turned off all the lights inside the cabin and stood in the darkness near the window. I could see movement at the tree line, something tall and broad that stayed just inside the shadows where the forest began. What kind of presence announces itself but refuses to cross the line into light? It didn't approach the cabin, and it didn't make any aggressive movements or sounds, but I could feel its attention focused on the structure where I stood. The shape remained motionless for what felt like an hour, and I remained equally still. Eventually, the shape withdrew deeper into the forest, and I heard the careful movement of its retreat. I didn't sleep that night, and when dawn finally broke over the mountains and light filtered through the cabin windows, I made a decision that felt both irrational and completely necessary. I prepared a plate of food, simple things like bread and cheese, and some leftover chicken from the night before, and I carried it outside to the edge of the clearing. I retreated back to the cabin, watching from the window. The plate remained untouched throughout the morning, and I began to wonder if I'd imagined the entire encounter, if isolation had finally started affecting my perception in ways I hadn't anticipated. But when I checked again in the early afternoon, the food was gone and the plate had been moved. It hadn't been knocked over or dragged away by scavengers, but instead sat upright on the same rock, positioned carefully as if someone had picked it up, emptied it, and then replaced it with deliberate precision. The plate was completely clean, not a crumb or smear remaining, and the surrounding area showed no signs of disturbance except for a single impression in the soft earth near the rock. The impression was enormous, easily twice the size of my own foot and shaped like a human footprint, but broader and with toes that spread wider than any person's would. I crouched down to examine it more closely, running my fingers along the edge where the weight had pressed deepest into the soil, and I felt a mixture of fear and fascination. I'd heard stories, of course. Everyone who spent time in remote wilderness areas had heard the tales and the speculation of Bigfoot, but I'd never given them serious consideration because my work had always focused on documented wildlife. If I'd spent my life chasing proof, what did it mean that proof had come to me instead? I continued the food offerings every morning, placing the plate in the same location and retreating to watch from the cabin. And every time the pattern repeated itself, with the food disappearing overnight and the plate being returned clean and upright. On the 9th night, I saw Bigfoot clearly for the first time, though the Sasquatch remained partially obscured by the shadows between the trees. He was massive, standing at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad, and he moved with a fluid grace that contradicted his size. He approached the rock where I'd left the food, moving in a crouch that brought him lower to the ground, and he paused frequently to look toward the cabin where I sat motionless on the porch. His eyes caught the faint light from the cabin windows, reflecting it back in a way that reminded me of a dog's eyes at night. But the intelligence behind that reflection was unmistakable and entirely different from any animal I'd ever photographed. Bigfoot reached the food and picked up the plate with both hands, holding it carefully as he examined the contents, and I could see the dexterity in his fingers as he selected pieces and brought them to his mouth. He ate slowly, and he never took his attention completely away from the cabin. When he finished, he set the plate back down with the same careful precision I'd observed before, and then he retreated into the forest. This pattern continued for weeks, and gradually the distance between us decreased as his comfort level seemed to increase. He began approaching while I was still visible on the porch, no longer waiting for me to go inside, and sometimes he would pause in his retreat to look back at me, his posture suggesting curiosity rather than fear or aggression. I started speaking to him softly during these encounters, nothing specific or meaningful, just the sound of my voice offered as another form of communication, and I noticed that he would tilt his head slightly when I spoke, as if processing the sounds and trying to understand their purpose. If he was learning my voice, what else was he learning about me? Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow that transformed the forest into a landscape of white and shadow, and I worried that Bigfoot might migrate away, or that the harsh conditions would end our strange relationship. But he continued to come, his visits marked by tracks in the fresh snow that led from the deep forest to the clearing and back again, and I increased the amount of food I offered, adding more protein and fat to help him maintain his body heat through the cold months. His fur grew thicker and darker, and I could see the physical changes in him as he adapted to the season, his body becoming even more massive as he built up reserves against the scarcity of winter. One morning in late December, I found the first gift waiting near the cabin door. It was an antler, a large one from what must have been a mature elk, but the points had been deliberately dulled, filed or rubbed down until they were smooth and incapable of causing injury. I picked it up and examined it carefully, understanding immediately that this wasn't something he'd simply found and dropped randomly, but rather an object Bigfoot had modified and placed with intention. I carried it inside and set it on the table, and that evening when I placed the food offering, I added an extra portion and arranged it more carefully than usual, trying to communicate my appreciation through the only means available to us. The gifts continued sporadically over the following months, each one demonstrating thought and consideration that went far beyond simple animal behavior. Bigfoot brought me fruit that didn't grow anywhere in the immediate area, varieties that must have come from miles away in lower elevations where the climate was milder. He left bundles of medicinal plants that I recognized from my years of wilderness photography, plants that had specific healing properties and were traditionally used by indigenous peoples in the region. Most remarkably, he returned items I'd lost during hikes in the surrounding mountains. A water bottle I'd dropped near a stream 3 miles north, a lens cap that had fallen from my camera bag on a ridge to the east, objects that proved he'd been aware of my movements far beyond the immediate area of the cabin. Spring arrived with the usual explosion of life and color, and I noticed changes in Bigfoot's behavior that suggested a deepening of whatever relationship we'd developed. He began waiting openly near the tree line when I emerged in the mornings, no longer hiding or maintaining complete concealment. And sometimes he would mimic my movements, raising his hand when I raised mine, tilting his head when I tilted mine, as if testing the boundaries of communication through gesture and imitation. We never touched, and I never attempted to approach him beyond the invisible boundary that seemed to exist between the cabin clearing and the forest edge. But the connection between us felt tangible and real in ways I couldn't explain to anyone, even if I'd wanted to. What happens when a boundary exists only because both sides choose to respect it? I noticed Bigfoot's reactions to certain sounds, particularly those that originated from human activity in the distant valleys below the mountain. When helicopters passed overhead, even miles away, he would freeze completely and then disappear into the forest with a speed that seemed impossible for something his size. Distant gunshots during hunting season produced the same response, and I began to understand that his relationship with me was an exception to a much deeper fear and avoidance of human contact. He associated humans with danger, with threats that required immediate retreat and concealment, and I represented something different only because of the time and consistency I'd invested in proving myself non-threatening. One morning in early summer, I made a decision that I'd been considering for months, and I brought my old camera out onto the porch, setting it on the railing where it would be visible but not immediately threatening. Bigfoot arrived for the morning food offering and stopped abruptly when he saw the camera, his entire body tensing in a way I'd never observed before. He stared at it for a long moment, and then he looked at me with an expression that seemed to combine confusion and betrayal, and I realized immediately that I'd made a serious mistake in introducing this element without preparation. Bigfoot didn't approach the food that morning, and he didn't return that evening or the next day, and I felt a genuine sense of loss that surprised me with its intensity. I removed the camera from the porch and stored it inside, and I continued placing food offerings even though they remained untouched for 3 days. On the 4th morning, I found the plate empty again, but he didn't show himself, and I understood that I'd damaged the trust we'd built and would need to rebuild it slowly and carefully. After crossing a line that couldn't be explained away, could trust ever return, or had I already sealed the outcome? It took nearly 2 weeks before Bigfoot allowed himself to be visible again during the food exchanges, and even then he maintained a greater distance than he had before, watching me with what I interpreted as wariness mixed with something that might have been disappointment. I continued the offerings without any attempt to reintroduce the camera, focusing instead on reestablishing the routine and comfort level we'd achieved before my mistake. And gradually I saw him begin to relax again, his approaches becoming less cautious and his departures less hurried. Summer deepened into the long, warm days of July and August, and I spent more time outside, working in the small garden I'd established near the cabin and performing maintenance tasks that had been postponed during the winter months. Bigfoot watched these activities from his usual position at the tree line, and I grew so accustomed to his presence that I found myself speaking to him regularly, narrating what I was doing or commenting on the weather or simply filling the silence with the sound of my voice. He never responded with vocalizations of his own, but his body language suggested he was listening and processing. One afternoon in late August, I was sitting on the porch steps sorting through old photography equipment, deciding what to keep and what to discard, when I came across a small portable printer I'd used in the field for making quick reference prints. An idea formed in my mind, something that felt both risky and potentially transformative, and I spent the next several days considering how to implement it without triggering another retreat. I decided to start by photographing myself, using the camera's timer function to capture images of me in various locations around the cabin, and then printing these images and displaying them openly where Bigfoot could observe them. Could an image explain intention where words still couldn't? I set up the first series of photos on the porch railing, images of myself standing near the garden, sitting on the steps, holding a plate of food, and I weighted them down with stones so they wouldn't blow away. That evening, when Bigfoot came for the food offering, he noticed the photographs immediately, approaching them with extreme caution and examining them from several angles before actually touching them. He picked up one of the images, holding it carefully between his massive fingers, and he looked from the photograph to me and back again several times, and I could see the moment when understanding registered in his expression. Bigfoot set the photograph down gently and picked up another, repeating the process of comparison and study. And then he looked at me directly with an intensity that made me catch my breath. I pointed to myself and then to the photograph, repeating the gesture several times, and then I picked up the camera and pointed to it, then to myself, then to the resulting image, trying to demonstrate the connection between the device and the representation it created. He watched this entire performance with focused attention, and when I finished, he gathered all the photographs carefully and carried them to the edge of the forest, where he sat down in a patch of fading sunlight and continued examining them for nearly an hour. Over the next week, I repeated this process, creating more photographs of myself and leaving them in various locations around the clearing, and each time he collected them and studied them with the same intense focus. I began including photographs of other subjects as well, images of the forest and the mountains and the animals that passed through the area, building a visual vocabulary that might help him understand what I wanted to eventually ask of him. He seemed to grasp the concept quickly, and I noticed that he began positioning himself more deliberately when he knew I was watching, as if testing whether I might be creating images of him even without the camera visible. If he was already anticipating the lens, how far ahead of me was his understanding? On a cool morning in early September, nearly a full year after our first encounter, I brought the camera out onto the porch again, but this time I held it in my hands, rather than simply placing it on the railing. He arrived for the morning offering and stopped when he saw it, but instead of retreating, he remained motionless, watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read. I pointed to the camera, then to him, then to an empty space on the porch railing where a photograph might be displayed, repeating the sequence several times while speaking softly about what I wanted to do and why it mattered to me. He stood completely still for what felt like an eternity, and I could see the conflict playing out in his posture, the tension between his instinctive fear of the device and his apparent understanding of what I was asking. Finally, he moved slightly, adjusting his position so that he was more fully visible in the morning light, and he looked directly at me with an expression that seemed to communicate both permission and trust. I raised the camera slowly, giving him time to change his mind or retreat, but he remained in place, though I could see his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. But at that time, I had no idea what he would say to me later, or how much this silent agreement would matter when he finally spoke. So why did that look feel like the start of a conversation I couldn't yet hear? I took 3 photographs in quick succession, and then I immediately lowered the camera and set it down on the porch, showing him that the process was complete. When I printed the photographs, I was struck by how clearly they captured not just his physical presence, but something of his personality and intelligence. His eyes in the images held a depth of awareness that was unmistakable, and his posture, even in his obvious discomfort, conveyed a dignity and presence that went far beyond anything I'd expected. I displayed the prints on the porch railing, and when he arrived that evening, he approached them with a mixture of curiosity and what might have been apprehension. Bigfoot picked up the first photograph and stared at it for a long time, bringing it close to his face and then holding it at arm's length. And then he touched his own face with his free hand, his fingers tracing the contours of his features as if confirming that the image truly represented him. He looked at me with an expression of wonder that was so human in its essence that I felt tears forming in my eyes. And he carefully set the photograph down and picked up the next one, repeating the process of examination and self-recognition. He spent nearly 2 hours with those images, studying them from every angle, and when he finally left, he carried one of them with him into the forest, holding it carefully as he disappeared into the shadows. The photography sessions became a regular part of our routine, though I was always careful to limit them and to watch for signs of stress or discomfort. He grew more comfortable with the camera over time, his poses becoming more natural and his reactions to the shutter sound less pronounced. I showed him every image I captured, printing them immediately and allowing him to examine them. I thought we were building trust through images alone, but was he waiting for the right moment to replace pictures with words, and how close was I to hearing the first one? In late October, I introduced the video camera, a small handheld device that I'd used extensively in my professional work for capturing animal behavior in real time. I showed him the camera first. He was fascinated by the movement and sound, leaning in close to the screen and reaching out as if to touch the image of me that moved and spoke within the device. When I asked if I could record him using gestures and the photographs to communicate my request, he agreed with less hesitation than I'd expected, positioning himself near the tree line where the light was good and the background showed the forest he called home. I recorded for only a few minutes that first time, capturing him as he moved slightly from side to side, as he looked around the clearing, as he reached down to touch the ground, and then stood again to his full height. When I played back the footage for him, his reaction was profound and immediate, a sharp intake of breath followed by complete stillness as he watched himself move and exist within the small screen. He reached toward the camera, his finger hovering just above the screen, and he made a sound I'd never heard from him before, a low vocalization that seemed to combine surprise and recognition and something deeper that I couldn't name. He watched the footage 3 times, and each time his focus seemed to intensify, as if he was discovering new aspects of himself in the recorded images. And when I finally turned off the camera, he sat down heavily on the ground, his expression distant and contemplative in a way that suggested he was processing something significant and perhaps overwhelming. The video recordings became more frequent and more extensive, and I began to capture not just his physical presence, but his interactions with the environment. One evening in November, he approached closer to the cabin than he ever had before, coming within 10 feet of where I stood on the porch. I had the video camera running, mounted on a tripod, and recording continuously, and he glanced at it briefly before returning his attention to me. He opened his mouth as if to speak, and I saw his throat working, muscles contracting and releasing as he struggled to produce sounds that his vocal anatomy wasn't designed to create easily. What emerged was rough and broken, syllables that approximated human speech but were distorted by the structure of his mouth and throat, and it took me a moment to recognize that he was attempting to say my name. I'd spoken it countless times in his presence, referring to myself in the third person during my narrations of daily activities. And he'd apparently been listening and learning and waiting for the moment when he felt comfortable enough to try using it himself. The sound he produced was close enough that I understood immediately what he was attempting, and I felt a rush of emotion so strong that I had to sit down on the porch steps to steady myself. What responsibility comes with being named by something the world refuses to believe exists? I responded by speaking his name, Bigfoot, and he tilted his head and repeated it back to me, his version clearer than his attempt at my name had been. We spent the next hour in a halting exchange of words, simple things like yes and no and food and cold. His vocabulary limited to what he'd overheard from me and perhaps from other humans he'd observed from a distance over the years. His grammar was non-existent and his pronunciation was difficult, but the intention and intelligence behind the effort were unmistakable, and I understood that we'd crossed into entirely new territory in our relationship. Over the following years, his speech improved gradually, his vocabulary expanding to include more complex concepts, and his ability to string words together into simple phrases, developing through practice and repetition. He told me in broken fragments that I had to piece together carefully that he'd been injured when he was younger, something about his leg that had healed incorrectly and left him slower than the others of his kind. He communicated through gestures and simple words that his group had left him behind, that their social structure valued strength and speed, and that weakness was not tolerated or accommodated. He'd been alone for many years, he told me, moving through territories that other groups had abandoned or avoided, staying away from humans except to observe them from safe distances. Through the winter months, our conversations deepened and expanded, though they remained limited by his vocabulary and the physical difficulty he experienced in producing human speech sounds. He told me things about his kind that I would never have learned through observation alone, fragments of information that built into a broader understanding of a species that had remained hidden and largely unknown despite sharing the continent with humans for thousands of years. He explained that his people could live for very long periods, that some of the elders in the groups he'd known as a younger individual had been alive for nearly 100 years, their knowledge and memory spanning generations of human activity and environmental change. What secrets survive when a species chooses hiding over extinction? Bigfoot told me that his kind had once been less fearful of humans, that there had been a time in the distant past when limited interaction occurred, when his people and mine had maintained a cautious but not entirely hostile relationship. But firearms had changed everything, he said. The ability of humans to kill from a distance without physical confrontation had made his kind retreat deeper into wilderness areas and adopt strict avoidance behaviors that were now fundamental to their survival. The cameras, he explained haltingly, were almost as feared as guns because his people had learned that being photographed often led to being hunted, that images brought more humans with weapons and traps and intentions that ranged from capture to killing. He'd overcome this fear with me, he said, because the years of consistent peaceful interaction had convinced him that I represented something different. But he made it clear through repeated emphasis that no other human could be trusted with the knowledge of his existence or location. Spring arrived again, marking 7 full years since our first encounter, and I noticed changes in his behavior that I couldn't immediately interpret. When I asked him what was wrong, he struggled to explain, his limited vocabulary inadequate for conveying whatever concern was occupying his thoughts. Bigfoot repeated the word others several times, and he gestured toward the deeper forest with movements that suggested distance and direction. I understood that he was trying to warn me about something, that other members of his kind were approaching or might approach, but I couldn't determine whether this was a normal occurrence or something that worried him specifically. In early May, on a morning that began like dozens of others before it, everything changed in a span of minutes that felt both impossibly fast and horribly slow. I'd placed the morning food offering and had returned to the porch with my video camera, recording as I usually did, when he emerged from the tree line moving faster than normal, his posture conveying urgency and fear. He looked directly at me and vocalized a single word, "Run." And then he turned toward the forest behind him as shapes materialized from the shadows between the trees. There were 4 of them, all larger than him, all moving with a coordinated precision that spoke of planning and purpose, and they ignored me completely as they converged on him from multiple angles. He didn't attempt to flee or fight, instead dropping to a submissive crouch that seemed to be some form of surrender or acknowledgement of their authority. But this didn't stop or even slow their attack. They struck him with closed fists and open palms, blows that landed with sounds like wood striking wood, and he absorbed the punishment without resistance, his only reaction a series of low vocalizations that might have been words in his own language or simply expressions of pain. The beating continued for several minutes, systematic and thorough, and when they finally stopped, he was lying motionless on the ground, his breathing labored, and his body showing obvious injuries. The largest one vocalized something, sounds that were clearly language, but in a register and pattern I couldn't begin to interpret, and the others responded by producing lengths of vine and flexible branches that they used to bind his arms and legs, working with a practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd performed such an action. They lifted him between them, 2 supporting his upper body and 2 his lower half, and they began carrying him toward the forest, moving in a direction different from the one they'd arrived from. He turned his head toward me once during this process, and our eyes met across the clearing, and I saw in his expression a complexity of emotions that I couldn't fully parse, but that included resignation and sorrow and perhaps apology. Then they were gone, disappeared into the forest as completely as if they'd never existed, and the clearing was silent except for the sound of my own breathing and the quiet mechanical whir of the camera still recording on its tripod. I stood on the porch for a long time after they'd vanished, my body refusing to move, my mind cycling through the events I'd just witnessed and trying to find some action I could take or response that would make sense. But there was nothing, no authority I could contact without betraying him further. I never saw him again after that morning, and the forest around the cabin became truly empty in a way it hadn't been even before our first encounter. The gifts he'd hidden remained where he'd placed them, slowly deteriorating through exposure to weather and time, and I left them undisturbed as a kind of memorial to what we'd shared. The food offerings I continued to place for weeks afterward were never touched, eventually attracting only conventional wildlife that had no understanding of the ritual's significance or history. Marcus Chen had one goal that took over his entire life: getting perfect footage of Bigfoot. At 31, this guy from Portland had spent the last 5 years putting every free moment and every dollar he had into this one mission. While other wildlife photographers were out filming deer and bears, Chen was hunting for something way more amazing and way harder to find. To most people, he was crazy, but everything changed on June 5th, 2015, when his camera captured something that would make even the biggest skeptics question what they thought they knew about these creatures. Chen's strategy was simple. Instead of trying to chase these creatures through the forest like everyone else did, he would let them come to him. Motion-activated cameras set up in the right spots could record for weeks, capturing natural behavior that no human could ever see. If Bigfoot was as smart as Chen thought, the creatures would eventually check out his equipment, and that investigation would be recorded in perfect detail. But Chen had no idea his cameras would capture behavior so advanced it would redefine what intelligence means in the animal kingdom. The breakthrough came when Chen studied sighting patterns in a Washington forest. Multiple people had reported seeing Bigfoot in the same area over 15 years, which meant either one creature lived there or a whole family considered this place their home. Even better, the sightings all happened around natural paths that would force any big creature to follow predictable routes. Chen spent months getting ready for what he knew would be his best shot at capturing real Bigfoot footage. He bought military-grade motion cameras with night vision, weatherproof cases that could handle anything, and memory storage that could record for a whole month. He was betting everything on this one trip, never imagining his cameras would document something that would challenge the very definition of what these creatures are capable of. On June 3, 2015, Chen finished setting up his most promising camera spot, what he called Position 7. He spent hours getting the camera angle and motion sensors perfect at that spot. But as Chen worked on his camera setup, he noticed signs that made his heart race. Fresh scratches on nearby trees were too high and too big to have been made by any known animal. The claw marks were about 12 inches long and carved deep into bark 8 feet off the ground. Exactly the kind of sign that Bigfoot researchers dream of finding. Even more exciting was the constant feeling of being watched while working. Years of being alone in the wilderness had taught him to trust these feelings, and something about Position 7 felt different. Chen had the strong impression that his work was being observed by something smart enough to stay hidden while studying what he was doing. Little did he know that intelligence was far more advanced than he could have ever imagined. Chen's final notes from June 3rd showed he was cautiously optimistic, but trying not to get his hopes up too high. The signs looked promising, but he'd been disappointed before by locations that seemed perfect but only recorded footage of regular forest animals. Still, something about Position 7 felt special. If Bigfoot were going to show up anywhere, it would be here. Chen left the forest on June 4th with a mix of excitement and nervousness that would bug him for the next 3 weeks. His cameras were recording continuously, potentially capturing the footage that would prove Bigfoot exists to the whole world. But Chen had learned not to expect too much. Disappointment was the most common result in Bigfoot research. What Chen didn't know was that his cameras were about to record something that would be way more amazing than anything he had ever imagined possible. The footage would show intelligence so advanced that it would force scientists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about non-human consciousness. At 3:47 a.m. on June 5th, less than 2 days after Chen had left the forest, his motion camera at Position 7 detected the movement he had been hoping for his entire adult life. The night vision sensors turned on as something huge approached the camera, taking deliberate, purposeful steps that were totally different from normal wildlife activity. What came out of the forest darkness was exactly what Chen had spent 5 years trying to capture: a real Bigfoot moving through its natural habitat with no idea that humans were watching. The creature stood about 7.5 feet tall, with a human-like posture and physical features clearly not human. Bigfoot's first appearance in Chen's footage was everything he had dreamed of and more. Dark brown hair covered the creature's massive body, with gray patches around the face and shoulders that suggested an older, experienced individual. The creature moved smoothly and confidently, showing none of the nervousness you'd expect from an animal in unfamiliar territory. But what happened next would begin a sequence of events that would build towards something absolutely mind-blowing. Instead of just passing through the area as Chen expected, the creature stopped and started examining his camera equipment with obvious curiosity and intelligence that challenged everything people thought they knew about animal behavior. Bigfoot's approach to Chen's camera demonstrated abilities and awareness beyond anything documented in previous Bigfoot research. The creature walked around the camera position for almost 3 minutes, studying the equipment from multiple angles with the careful attention of a scientist examining something they'd never seen before. But this was just the beginning of behavior that would culminate in something truly extraordinary. Chen's night vision footage captured details about Bigfoot that no previous researcher had ever recorded. The creature's hands were clearly visible as it moved closer to the camera. 5 distinct fingers, including a thumb with proportions about twice the size of human hands, but showing similar skill and range of motion. At 3:52 a.m., Bigfoot made direct physical contact with Chen's camera equipment in a way that would completely change the understanding of how smart these creatures are. Instead of touching the device randomly or trying to break it, Bigfoot examined the camera with deliberate precision, suggesting it understood what the technology was for. The creature's handling of Chen's equipment showed problem-solving abilities and mechanical understanding that challenged the very definition of animal intelligence. Bigfoot touched the lens housing gently, traced mounting hardware with careful finger movements, and studied the blinking recording light with obvious understanding of what it meant. Yet this display of intelligence was merely setting the stage for what would come later. For the next 8 minutes and 12 seconds, Chen's camera recorded behavior that mainstream science would say was impossible. Bigfoot crouched directly in front of the lens, bringing its face within 3 feet of the recording equipment, and examined the device with careful attention, revealing remarkable intelligence. The most incredible part of this examination was that Bigfoot seemed to understand what the camera did. The creature's attention was focused on the lens and recording indicators, suggesting it knew the device was capturing its image and behavior. This tech awareness led to behavior that went way beyond animal curiosity and showed abstract thinking that would soon manifest in ways that would blow your mind. At 3:58 a.m., Bigfoot demonstrated intelligence that would challenge every scientific assumption about what these creatures could do. After examining the camera from multiple angles, the creature reached behind the device and carefully adjusted the tripod mounting system with precision that required an understanding of how mechanical systems work and of spatial relationships. The tripod adjustment was deliberate and exact. The creature moved Chen's camera 15 degrees to the left, creating a better viewing angle of the forest clearing. This change required Bigfoot to understand the relationship between camera position and what it could record, demonstrate mechanical knowledge of how tripod systems work, and use precise motor control to achieve the desired result. But Bigfoot's tech interaction was only the beginning of behavior that would build towards something that would redefine the understanding of how smart these creatures are. After finishing the camera adjustment, the creature stepped back and looked at its work with obvious satisfaction, tilting its head to study the new recording angle with aesthetic judgment that suggested sophisticated mental processing. The creature's satisfaction with its camera modification led to behavior that set this encounter apart from any previous Bigfoot documentation. Instead of leaving after its tech interaction, Bigfoot turned away from the camera and disappeared into the forest for several minutes, leaving Chen's equipment recording an empty clearing with the improved view the creature had deliberately created. But Bigfoot wasn't done. What it would do next would demonstrate intelligence that approaches human-level thinking. At 4:06 a.m., Bigfoot returned carrying something that would transform this encounter from remarkable to extraordinary. The creature came out of the forest with a large river stone, smooth, oval-shaped, about the size of a grapefruit, that it had obviously picked from a location outside the camera's recording range. Bigfoot's return with the stone showed planning and intentional behavior that challenged the very definition of what animals could do. The creature had left the camera position with clear purpose, found a specific object that met particular requirements, and returned to carry out a plan that suggested abstract thinking and creative expression. What followed was behavior that would revolutionize understanding of Bigfoot intelligence and artistic ability. The creature carried the stone to a position directly in front of Chen's camera lens, placing it carefully within the adjusted recording frame with movements that were precise and deliberate. The stone placement revealed thinking abilities that mainstream science refuses to believe exist outside human intelligence. After positioning the stone in the center of the camera frame, Bigfoot stepped back and studied the visual composition from the camera's perspective, evaluating the arrangement with aesthetic judgment that suggested artistic ability. The creature wasn't satisfied with its first placement. After studying the composition, Bigfoot returned to make a small adjustment, moving the stone slightly to the left to achieve better visual balance within the recording frame. This compositional refinement showed understanding of aesthetic principles and visual design that approached artistic expression. With the stone placement completed, Bigfoot stepped back to its full impressive height and looked directly into Chen's camera for 3 full seconds. The creature's expression during this direct eye contact was unmistakable. Awareness, intelligence, and conscious acknowledgement of the recording process that proved these beings understand technology and its purpose. After its direct camera acknowledgement, Bigfoot turned and walked back into the forest with the same smooth motion that had characterized its approach. Within moments, the creature vanished into the darkness, leaving only the carefully placed stone as evidence that this extraordinary encounter had happened. But this was just the first part of an exchange that would culminate in something absolutely unbelievable. Chen's camera continued recording throughout the rest of the night, but the forest remained empty except for the stone that sat in perfect visual composition within the frame the creature had deliberately adjusted. Bigfoot had turned Chen's research equipment into interactive communication technology. When Chen discovered this footage during a preliminary equipment check on June 7th, he realized he had captured something that was way beyond his wildest dreams. But the documentary filmmaker's scientific training told him this could be an attempt at communication, and his Bigfoot research instincts demanded that he test this theory through controlled experimentation. What he was about to discover would challenge everything science believes about these creatures. Chen made a decision that would extend this encounter into unprecedented territory. He would respond to Bigfoot's stone placement with his own offering and see if the creature would engage in further interaction. This was the opportunity every Bigfoot researcher dreamed of, the chance to establish communication with these elusive beings. But Chen had no idea he was about to witness something that would redefine what it means to be intelligent. Chen returned to position 7 carrying a small cloth bag filled with mixed nuts and dried fruit, trail mix that represented a clear human offering that couldn't be mistaken for natural forest objects. His plan was to replace Bigfoot's stone with his own gift and document whether the creature would respond with continued interaction. But Chen's experimental design went beyond simple object exchange. He installed a second motion-activated camera at a hidden position 200 yards from his primary recording location. This backup camera would provide secondary documentation of any Bigfoot activity while remaining concealed from the creature's obvious awareness of his primary equipment. The dual camera setup reflected Chen's understanding that he was potentially documenting behavior that would be dismissed by mainstream science unless supported by multiple sources of evidence. If Bigfoot returned and showed further intelligent behavior, Chen wanted rock-solid proof that could withstand inevitable skepticism. He had no idea he was about to capture something that would make skepticism impossible. Chen completed his experimental setup on the afternoon of June 7th and left the forest with anticipation that bordered on obsession. His entire adult life had been leading to this moment, the possibility of establishing communication with Bigfoot and proving these creatures had intelligence that science refused to acknowledge. The answer to Chen's experiment came at 11:34 p.m. on June 8th, when both cameras detected movement approaching position 7. Bigfoot's return was captured from multiple angles as the creature approached Chen's modified setup with obvious awareness of both recording devices. What was about to unfold would demonstrate intelligence so advanced it would challenge the very definition of consciousness. Bigfoot's detection of Chen's dual camera system showed observational abilities that exceeded anything in previous Bigfoot research. The creature's approach path and body positioning showed clear recognition of both recording devices, suggesting environmental awareness that allowed it to detect hidden technology specifically designed to avoid animal detection. But Bigfoot's tech awareness was surpassed by its response to Chen's trail mix offering. The creature approached the bag with immediate recognition that the object represented intentional communication from the human who had installed the recording equipment. This wasn't cautious animal curiosity. This was intelligent recognition of deliberate interaction. Bigfoot's handling of Chen's offering showed fine motor control and sensory sophistication that challenged every assumption about what these creatures could do. The bag was examined through touch and smell with deliberate precision, the creature's massive hands manipulating the fabric and contents with skill that rivaled human manipulation. Chen's backup camera captured what happened next from a perfect angle that revealed details invisible in the primary footage. After examining the trail mix bag thoroughly, Bigfoot sat down cross-legged directly in front of Chen's primary camera and proceeded to eat the offered food, with behavior that was remarkably human-like in its precision and social awareness. But this was just the prelude to something truly extraordinary. For 6 minutes and 43 seconds, both cameras documented a Bigfoot engaging in controlled eating behavior that showed intelligence, manual dexterity, and social sophistication that mainstream science insists cannot exist outside human species. The creature opened Chen's trail mix bag carefully to avoid tearing the material, then picked through the contents with obvious selectivity and preference. Bigfoot's food selection revealed thinking abilities that went far beyond simple hunger satisfaction. The creature ate cashews and dried cranberries while throwing almonds onto the ground, beside where it was sitting. This selective behavior suggested taste preferences and decision-making processes that indicated sophisticated mental processing. But the most remarkable aspect of Bigfoot's eating behavior was its obvious awareness of being recorded. Between bites, the creature glanced directly at Chen's primary camera with acknowledgement that was clearly deliberate rather than coincidental. Bigfoot was performing for the camera while maintaining conscious awareness of its audience. Yet even this incredible display was building towards something that would leave you speechless. When Bigfoot finished eating Chen's trail mix, its behavior moved into territory that went beyond animal response and entered the realm of abstract communication. Instead of dropping the empty bag or leaving it scattered, the creature carefully folded the packaging material with precise finger movements that created a neat, compact rectangle. The bag folding showed respect for Chen's offering and understanding of reciprocal social obligations that suggested these creatures operate according to complex social rules. Bigfoot wasn't simply eating offered food, it was participating in a structured exchange that acknowledged the communication attempt. But what came next would demonstrate intelligence that approaches human-level consciousness. Bigfoot's response to Chen's offering exceeded every expectation and challenged every assumption about what these creatures could do. After folding the empty trail mix bag and setting it aside, Bigfoot reached behind its back and produced something it had apparently been carrying throughout its approach to the camera position. What the creature revealed was 5 pine cones bound together with twisted grapevines in an arrangement that was clearly artificial and obviously intentional. The pine cone bundle represented deliberate craft production that required planning, material selection, and manual construction techniques that indicated sophisticated thinking abilities. The pine cone bundle's construction suggested abstract thinking that went far beyond simple tool use into territory that approached artistic expression and symbolic communication. Bigfoot had selected specific pine cones based on size and shape requirements, found appropriate binding material, and constructed an aesthetically pleasing arrangement that served no practical purpose beyond communication. The creature's presentation of its pine cone creation showed understanding of reciprocity principles and social exchange that challenged the very definition of intelligence as applied to non-human species. This was conscious participation in structured communication that acknowledged Chen's offering and provided an appropriate response. Bigfoot's placement of its pine cone bundle revealed the same compositional awareness and aesthetic judgment that had characterized its initial stone placement. The creature positioned the bundle precisely in the center of Chen's camera frame, ensuring optimal visibility and visual balance within the recording perspective. After completing its gift placement, Bigfoot repeated the direct camera acknowledgement that had concluded its initial encounter. The creature stood to its full impressive height and looked directly into both of Chen's cameras in sequence, turning its head deliberately to acknowledge each recording device individually. But what happened next would be the moment that changes everything. Bigfoot's direct eye contact with Chen's cameras lasted 3 full seconds for each device, a duration that was clearly intentional rather than coincidental. During this eye contact, the creature's expression conveyed awareness, understanding, and conscious communication with the human intelligence that would eventually view this footage. But the final moment of Chen's extraordinary documentation provided evidence that would challenge every scientific assumption about Bigfoot intelligence and communication ability. As the creature concluded its direct camera acknowledgement and prepared to leave, it did something that no animal has ever been documented doing, something that would prove these beings possess intelligence that rivals our own. Bigfoot raised one massive hand toward Chen's primary camera. But this wasn't just any gesture. The creature deliberately formed what could only be described as a wave. The hand moved in a clear, unmistakable waving motion that lasted about 2 seconds and showed absolutely clear intention rather than random movement. This was the moment that would change everything. Bigfoot had just waved goodbye to the camera, a deliberate, conscious farewell gesture that indicated not just intelligence, but understanding of human social conventions and the desire to communicate using recognizable human gestures. The implications were staggering. This creature understood it was being recorded, knew a human would eventually watch this footage, and chose to communicate directly with that future human observer using a universally recognized gesture of acknowledgement and farewell. After its farewell wave, Bigfoot turned and walked back into the forest with the same smooth motion that had characterized its approach. Within moments, the creature vanished completely into the darkness, leaving only its pine cone bundle as evidence that this remarkable exchange had occurred. When Chen retrieved his cameras on June 24th and reviewed the complete footage for the first time, he realized he had accomplished something that no Bigfoot researcher had ever achieved. He had not only captured clear, undeniable footage of these creatures, he had documented intelligence, technological understanding, and communication abilities that challenged the fundamental assumptions of modern science. The wave changed everything. It proved that Bigfoot doesn't just possess intelligence. These creatures understand human communication, recognize technology, and actively choose to interact with us when they feel safe to do so. Chen's footage represents the first documented evidence of a Bigfoot deliberately communicating with humans, using recognizable gestures, forever changing what we know about these remarkable beings. Marcus Chen had achieved his life's goal of capturing Bigfoot on camera, but what he discovered was far more extraordinary than he had ever imagined possible. Thomas Banister had spent 20 years pointing cameras at animals in the Pacific Northwest forests. He had filmed bear behavior in the Cascades, followed wolf-pack dynamics across 3 winters in Idaho, and spent 3 consecutive winters embedded with a Roosevelt elk herd in the Olympic Peninsula. He understood large animal behavior the way someone understands anything they have spent 2 decades watching closely, not from textbooks, but from the accumulated weight of having seen what was normal so many times that the first moment something was not normal registered before he could have explained why. He knew what hunting looked like. He knew what instinct looked like. What he watched on his editing screen on November 8, 2016, was neither of those things. It was something he did not have a word for yet, and the word he eventually settled on, after a year of working through what the footage meant, was the reason he made a decision at the end of that year that most people in his field thought was wrong. He withheld evidence, deliberately. He had a second clip, captured almost a year after the first, and he chose not to release it, not because he doubted what it showed, but because of what a year of studying the first clip had taught him about what was living in that forest. And the reasoning behind that decision is the part of this story that does not resolve cleanly. Thomas had arrived at the Hoh River area of Olympic National Park in late October 2016, following Roosevelt elk through the early stages of their winter migration. The Hoh rainforest was old-growth Pacific Northwest at its most dense, Douglas fir and Sitka spruce with canopies so thick that midday light barely touched the ground. The river flats pulled elk down from the ridges, and the game trails were ancient, worn so deep into the soil by generations of the same animals using the same routes for so many years that the paths looked more like trenches than trails. Thomas had been in this area before. He knew the river crossings. He knew the game trails. He knew exactly which crossing to put a camera on to get footage worth driving all the way from Seattle 4. He bolted a high-resolution motion-activated unit 12 feet up a Douglas fir on November 1st, angled toward a shallow crossing point where fresh elk tracks showed the animals had been coming through regularly. The camera could record in clear detail even in near darkness, and its trigger was fast enough to catch almost any animal that moved through the frame. Thomas checked the angle, made sure the battery was full, and drove back to his camp near the park entrance. He planned to come back in 5 days, pull the memory card, see what he had, and reposition the camera if he needed to. He pulled the card on November 8th. He was expecting elk footage. The clip from 6:44 a.m. on November 3rd opened on a normal dawn scene. Soft gray light coming through the trees, the river moving slow and dark, a section of muddy bank where the water got shallow enough to cross without much trouble. The motion trigger had caught a young black-tailed deer stepping into the shot from the left side of the frame, picking its way carefully down the bank toward the water with the nervous start and stop walk of an animal that was paying attention to its surroundings but had not picked up on anything specific to be scared of yet. The deer looked like it weighed around 90 pounds, young, still a little unsure of itself, ears swiveling to catch any sound, nose testing the cool morning air. It reached the edge of the water and put its head down to drink. The camera was still running when the big cedar tree on the right side of the frame suddenly had something behind it that had not been there a moment before. Bigfoot stepped out from behind the trunk of a massive old-growth cedar about 40 feet from the deer and placed itself with a kind of slow, deliberate purpose that was completely unlike anything Thomas had seen in 20 years of wildlife filming. It did not wander in. It did not step through. It placed itself. One moment the cedar was just a cedar. The next moment something was using it as a hide, and the way it tucked in behind the trunk, the exact angle it picked to stay out of the deer's sightline, the instant total stillness it dropped into the moment it was in position. All of it communicated one thing without any ambiguity at all. This was a plan, already in progress before the camera caught it. Bigfoot was at least 8 feet tall. Its hair was dark brown with lighter coloring across the face and chest, and the individual hairs were clearly visible in the morning light, moving slightly in the river breeze the way real hair moves. The way actual individual strands shift at different speeds when the wind catches them, darker along the spine and thicker on the arms where the coat was more matted. Its shoulders were wider than anything Thomas had ever pointed a camera at. Its arms, visible where they gripped the bark of the cedar, hung past its knees. Its hands, spread out flat against the tree trunk, covered what Thomas would later estimate at nearly 3 feet of bark, and then nothing moved, not once. The deer kept drinking, head down, completely unaware. Bigfoot had not made a sound. The position it had chosen put it in the cedar shadow and broke up its outline enough that from the deer's direction it was almost invisible. And that was not an accident. To choose that specific position required knowing in advance where the deer would be looking. The deer had been completely outthought. 17 seconds passed. The camera recorded every one of them. During those 17 seconds, Bigfoot didn't move a single time. No weight shifts, no muscle twitches, none of the small involuntary movements that every large animal makes simply from being alive. Its head stayed locked on the deer, tracking without a single adjustment. Whatever was happening in Bigfoot's mind, the body was under a level of voluntary control that had no equivalent in any predator Thomas had ever studied. He would later say the stillness was the most disturbing part of the whole clip, not what came after it, but what it implied about what was going on before. Then it launched? That was the word Thomas used every single time he described what came next. Not ran, not charged, launched. From total stillness to full speed in what looked like a single movement. No building, no transition, no middle stage. One moment completely still behind the cedar. The next moment, covering ground at a speed the camera's microphone recorded as heavy thumping impacts, each one barely a fraction of a second apart. Each one hitting like something very large and very fast was making contact with the earth, 40 feet in under 3 seconds. The deer's head came up at the second footfall, its legs loaded, its hindquarters dropped, its whole body gathered to run. The exact sequence of a prey animal that has just understood it needs to leave right now. The reaction was fast. Any predator that Forrest had, mountain lion, bear, wolf, would have watched the deer clear the gap. Bigfoot was already there before the deer's legs could fire. What happened at the moment of contact was the part of the footage that made every person who watched it go quiet. Bigfoot did not drive the deer to the ground, did not crash into it, did not do what any predator in that ecosystem would do, use body mass and impact to bring it down. Instead, in one motion, flowing directly out of the sprint, Bigfoot reached down with one arm and simply picked the deer up. One arm, one motion. A 90-pound animal in full panic, legs pumping against nothing, throwing its body weight in every direction, and Bigfoot absorbed all of it without breaking stride. The deer ended up tucked under Bigfoot's arm like a carried object, controlled and going nowhere, while Bigfoot crossed the remaining stretch of riverbank and hit the tree line at the same speed it had been running since the cedar. By the time it reached the trees, nothing about the way it moved suggested it was carrying anything at all, just the deer's legs sticking out, still kicking, and the sounds the deer was making, still audible on the camera's microphone, until the forest took both of them. 31 seconds from Bigfoot's first appearance to the moment the trees closed behind it. The camera kept recording for 2 more minutes after that, showing nothing but the empty riverbank and the slow-moving water. The section of the bank where the deer had been drinking looked completely undisturbed. No blood, no tracks scattered in panic patterns, no fur or debris of the kind any other predator encounter leaves behind. The scene looked almost exactly the same as it had before any of it occurred, which was its own kind of disturbing because it meant this was practiced. A cleanup this complete, an exit this clean and fast, did not happen by accident the first time. And if it was not the first time, then this river crossing had a history that nobody had been present to document. The deer that had come to this water source over months and years before Thomas's camera arrived had come and gone from a crossing that was being hunted regularly, and no evidence of any of it had been left behind for anyone to find. Thomas watched the clip 7 times before he drove back to Seattle. He spent the first full day running every check he knew from 2 decades of documentary work. The hair moved differently on different parts of Bigfoot's body, the strands across its shoulders responding to the breeze differently than the thicker matted sections lower down its arms, exactly the way real hair of different lengths behaves in wind. Beneath the hair, the muscles of its shoulders and upper back were visibly working as it ran, in the same shifting, rolling pattern that any large running animal produces. During the stillness behind the cedar, Bigfoot's chest rose and fell with its breathing. He spent a long time on the hands. The grip on the cedar trunk was 5-fingered, each finger fully wrapped around the bark, with a span that no human hand came close to matching. The single-arm scoop that lifted a panicked 90-pound animal mid-sprint, one smooth downward motion, complete control, no visible exertion, no change in pace. Thomas had spent 20 years filming large animals. He understood enough about what bodies could and could not do to know that what he had just watched placed Bigfoot in a category of physical strength that nothing he had ever filmed belonged to. He ran the speed numbers multiple ways. The distance from the cedar to the deer was 40 feet, a measurement he had made himself on his last visit to the location. Bigfoot had covered that distance in under 3 seconds, starting from a complete standstill, maintaining that speed through the grab, and through carrying a struggling animal all the way to the forest edge. The numbers he kept arriving at were somewhere between 25 and 28 miles per hour. Bigfoot's estimated weight, based on body proportions, put it in the same class as a large male grizzly bear. A grizzly's top sprint is faster, but only over short distances and with nothing to carry. The combination of that speed, that weight, and that grip strength while managing a 90-pound struggling animal had no match in any wildlife data Thomas could find. But the speed, by the time he had finished analyzing the 17 seconds, was almost beside the point. He reached out to a wildlife biologist he had worked with before, someone who ran an independent research station near Ashford and had a reputation for careful, skeptical work. The biologist watched the footage, asked for a second copy, and called Thomas back the same evening. The call went on for 2 hours. What the biologist kept returning to was not the speed or the strength, it was the 17 seconds. Those 17 seconds had no match anywhere in the documented behavior of large North American predators. Not bears, not mountain lions, the most patient ambush hunters in the region. Nothing in their behavioral records showed what the footage showed. Deliberate selection of a specific piece of cover based on the prey's approach direction, holding that position through 2 alert responses without a single movement, and timing the launch to the exact moment of maximum exposure. That was not predatory instinct, that was a hunting strategy. The biologist said those words carefully. Not a behavior, not a reflex, not an instinct, a strategy. Then the biologist brought up the cedar tree itself, and this was the point in the analysis where the question shifted from what Bigfoot could do to what Bigfoot knew. That game trail was old. The path had been worn into the soil by deer and elk, using the same route to the same water source for so many generations that it looked carved. Any large animal spending regular time in that forest would have crossed that trail many times and would have seen deer and elk using it repeatedly. The cedar Bigfoot used for cover was the single best concealment position at that approach angle, the only piece of cover that worked from the direction the deer had come from. To have chosen it, Bigfoot had to have known in advance which direction the deer would come from. That was not something figured out in the moment. That was accumulated knowledge of a specific hunting ground, built through repeated experience in that specific territory, which meant this was not Bigfoot's first hunt at this crossing, which meant Bigfoot had been hunting this river crossing from that cedar using that game trail long before Thomas's camera arrived, long before Thomas had ever been in this forest. And the deer that had come to this water source over those months and years had no idea what was waiting for them because Bigfoot had never given them a reason to find out. The biologist flagged one more thing in a follow-up call 3 days later. The deer had actually paused twice on its approach, once at the tree line, again at about 15 feet from the bank, rotating its ears and lifting its nose, doing the careful scanning of an animal that has registered something vaguely wrong without being able to identify a specific threat. The deer had, on some level, sensed something was there, and Bigfoot had held perfectly frozen through both of those moments. Not a twitch, not a readjustment. Nothing that let the deer's alarm system lock on and confirm. The biologist said he had spent years studying predator-prey dynamics in Pacific Northwest forests and had never documented any large predator with the impulse control to hold position through 2 close-range alert responses. That level of control, he said, was not something animals had. It was something that thinking things had. Thomas reached out to a second expert, a video forensics specialist who ran a small independent lab outside of Olympia and had done authenticity work on documentary footage before. He sent the full video file with all of the camera's built-in data left intact, the compression information, the timestamps from the internal clock, the GPS location data written directly into the file. He asked for a complete analysis and deliberately did not tell the technician anything about what the footage showed. The technician came back 8 days later with a full report. It went through every technical indicator of digital manipulation that video forensics tools could detect, how compression artifacts behaved across the file, whether the timestamps matched up correctly, how motion blur worked at the edges of the moving subject, whether the lighting stayed consistent as Bigfoot moved from shadow into the early morning light near the river, whether shadow directions matched the actual sun position for that timestamp, and GPS location. The report found 0 indicators of manipulation. Everything was consistent with genuine footage captured by that camera model under those lighting conditions on that morning. The technician added a personal note at the end. If someone had faked the footage, they would have needed to do it at a level of technical skill beyond anything achievable with standard equipment, and would have needed to know the exact position of a hidden elk camera, the exact time a deer would approach that crossing, and the exact quality of the light that specific morning. The simpler explanation, the technician wrote, was that the footage was real. Thomas presented the clip at a closed cryptozoology conference in British Columbia in December 2016. He put together a presentation that included the raw clip, his own frame-by-frame breakdown, and both independent expert reports. He had decided going in that he was not going to try to push the audience toward any particular conclusion. No dramatic voiceover, no leading questions, no attempt to get ahead of what people were thinking while they watched. He showed the clip, shared the data, and let the 31 seconds do the work. The response was the kind of divided, tense silence that precedes serious argument, because everyone in that room understood what the hunting sequence meant. Not a large primate opportunistically finding food. An apex predator with a defined method, deep territorial knowledge, and physical capabilities that placed it above every other predator in the Olympic Peninsula. The researchers who had spent years building behavioral evidence for Bigfoot's existence understood right away what they were looking at. The skeptics focused on what was missing: no carcass, no hair, no castable prints. Footage alone had never been considered enough. But underneath both reactions was the question that the hunting sequence actually raised, the one that did not resolve into either category. Not whether the footage was real, not whether more evidence was needed. How long had something with that level of hunting intelligence been operating in that forest, using those specific crossings, making decisions based on that specific territorial knowledge? And how many other forests were there, with their own crossings and their own cedar trees, where the same thing had been happening without a single trail camera ever being in the right place at the right time? Thomas announced at the conference that he was going back to the Olympic Peninsula in the spring of 2017 with a small team and proper search equipment, with the goal of finding physical evidence at and around the site. He was not done with the Hoh River corridor. Whatever had been using that cedar as a regular hunting position had been doing it before his camera arrived, and he believed it was still doing it. The spring 2017 trip brought him back to the river crossing with a 3-person team and equipment that included sensors for detecting buried organic material and dogs trained to locate wildlife remains. They searched the area around the cedar for 4 full days, expanding outward in the direction Bigfoot had gone when it left the frame. They found disturbed vegetation in a pattern consistent with the exit path. They found one partial impression in soft ground near the river's edge, too weathered to cast, but large enough and correctly oriented to be consistent with a very large bipedal footprint. That was it. The forest had done what Pacific Northwest old growth does. 4 months of rain and heavy biological activity had broken down and absorbed whatever evidence had been there. Nothing was left to recover. Thomas came back to Seattle with the spring findings and added them to the file he had been building since November. The partial imprint photographs, the mapped vegetation disturbance, the forensic lab report, the biologist's behavioral analysis, the speed and strength breakdown from his frame-by-frame work on the original footage. He compiled it into a single document and sent copies to the small group of researchers he trusted to handle it seriously. In September 2017, he returned again. He set cameras at 12 locations within a 2-mile radius, not to catch Bigfoot directly, because he had already understood that the original clip had only happened because the camera was there for elk. Whatever awareness Bigfoot had about human activity in its territory put it at a permanent advantage over any camera placed deliberately to find it. He went back to understand the territory, what Bigfoot used, how it moved through the forest over time. The cameras ran through fall and into early winter 2017. Several captured elk footage exactly as planned. One caught a black bear working a section of riverbank about half a mile north of the original location. 3 recorded nothing except the forest changing light and weather across the recording window. One camera, set up on a ridge overlooking the river corridor about 3/4 of a mile southeast of the cedar tree, caught something on the evening of October 19th, 2017. Something large and upright, moving through the thick undergrowth at the top of the ridge with the steady, unhurried pace of an animal that was not startled and was not in any rush to get somewhere. It was in the frame for less than 4 seconds, and the low light had pushed the image quality down to the point where specific details were hard to make out. But the shape was the same. The silhouette, how wide the shoulders were, how long the arms were compared to the rest of the body height, the two-legged stride, matched what Thomas had spent the better part of a year studying in careful detail from the November 2016 clip. Whatever had used that cedar tree as a hunting blind was still in that forest almost a year later, still moving through it, still unhurried, still invisible to every deliberately placed camera in a 2-mile grid, and only caught it all because one unit happened to be pointed at the right ridge at the right moment. Thomas added the clip to his file and made the hardest professional decision of his career. He chose not to release it, not because he doubted what it showed, because a year of working through the behavioral evidence in the original footage had brought him to a specific conclusion about what kind of intelligence was operating in the Hoh River corridor. And that conclusion made him genuinely uncomfortable with the idea of directing more human attention into the territory it was living in. The 31 seconds had started as a question about what Bigfoot was. By the end of 12 months, it had become a question about what happens when something that intelligent, that capable, that practiced in remaining invisible, what happens when the world finds out exactly where it is. The November 2016 footage showed something faster than every other animal in that forest, stronger than every other animal in that forest, patient enough to hold 17 seconds of perfect voluntary stillness while a prey animal closed the distance, strategic enough to have chosen its hide based on advanced knowledge of how that specific animal would approach that specific water source. It had taken a 90-pound deer in a single-arm grab at full sprint, disappeared into old-growth timber in 31 seconds, and left a scene so undisturbed that the river crossing looked exactly as it had before any of it occurred. That footage, 31 seconds on a November morning by the Hoh River, remained the most complete behavioral documentation of Bigfoot ever captured. Not because of what it showed about Bigfoot's size or appearance, because of what those 17 seconds of total stillness before the sprint revealed about what was happening behind its eyes. The speed was extraordinary, the strength was extraordinary, but the plan, the selection of that cedar at that angle, based on that knowledge of that trail, was what put this footage in a different category from every piece of Bigfoot evidence that had come before it. What Thomas Banister's trail camera caught on November 3, 2016, was not a Bigfoot sighting. It was a predator operating inside a territory it understood completely, faster than everything else in that forest, stronger than everything else in that forest, invisible to every deliberately placed camera in a 2-mile search grid for the entire following year, and apparently aware enough of human activity in its range to have adjusted its behavior accordingly. The 31 seconds of footage had started as a question about what Bigfoot was. The year that followed turned it into a question Thomas eventually decided he was not willing to answer out loud. What would happen to that territory and to what was living in it if the rest of the world came to understand exactly what it was capable of? He had a second clip. He kept it to himself, and the Hoh River corridor kept going, old growth and rain and game trails worn deep into the earth. And somewhere in it, if the October 2017 footage meant what Thomas believed it meant, the cedar tree by the river crossing was still there and still being used, and the deer still had no idea. Stellin Ver had worked on investigative cases for 11 years. A timber called him 4 days after their bulldozer went missing from a contested logging site in the Six Rivers National Forest in Northern California. Not stolen, not broken down, but missing in the sense that pieces of it had been found in 3 separate locations and nobody could explain how they had gotten there or what had been strong enough to separate them from the rest of the machine. The first step was collecting the camera grid the logging crew had already installed. Before he even walked the terrain or studied topographic maps, Stellin drove the access roads and flagged each motion-activated trail camera the loggers had mounted around the worksite and along the road where the machine had last been confirmed operational. The company had placed them weeks earlier to document equipment activity and keep records during the dispute, which meant the cameras had been watching the area long before the bulldozer disappeared. Over the years, those cameras had captured bears wandering through cut blocks, vandals slipping past locked gates, poachers checking game trails, and the occasional lost hiker cutting through timber roads after dark. In 11 years of reviewing footage like that, they had never recorded anything that made Stellin sit in his truck and replay the same clip multiple times before he could bring himself to step outside. Camera 4 was positioned along the edge of a dense section of old-growth Douglas fir, mounted at chest height on a tree just off the service road that ran along the upper logging boundary. The footage was 1 minute and 39 seconds long. Stellin had watched it on the small screen of his laptop, parked at the edge of that same service road with the engine off and the afternoon light coming in flat through the windshield. How could less than 2 minutes of footage contain the answer to a mystery that had already scattered a bulldozer across the forest? The first seconds showed the road at the point where it curved past the tree line before opening into the staging area. The light was poor. A heavy overstory kept the ground mostly in shadow, with a few narrow shafts coming through at angles, shifting slightly as the branches moved in a high wind that couldn't quite reach the ground. For the first 2 seconds, there was nothing. Then something moved in the shadows between the trees, and Stellin felt his body go still in a way it did not usually go still. What kind of thing moves through a dark forest at that size and that speed and doesn't bother to stay in the shadows? A Sasquatch stepped into one of the narrow shafts of light, and the light was enough. It was upright. It was massive. Reddish-brown hair covered it from head to foot, dense and layered, the coat thickest across the shoulders and upper back, where it bunched and shifted with each stride. It moved with the kind of weight that you don't fake, not the performed heaviness of someone trying to walk large, but the deep structural weight of something that has never once in its life needed to consider what might be bigger than it. Every step compressed the road surface with a finality that had nothing theatrical in it. Stellin's first thought, embarrassingly, was that the camera had malfunctioned. Some trick of the lens, a compression artifact, something that would resolve into a bear or a downed tree if he just let it settle. His second thought arrived about a half-second later, when the full figure came into the light, and the scale of it became undeniable, and that second thought had no words attached to it. His hands had gone still on the laptop keyboard. He was not aware of deciding to stop moving. He just had. If the footage wasn't a malfunction, then what exactly was Stellin watching walk across the same road he was parked beside? 8 feet tall, at minimum. He had done enough outdoor work, enough time measuring elk trails and bear markings against known reference points, to have a decent eye for height and scale, and he had never been far off. This was 8 feet, possibly a shade more, and he arrived at that number without having to think hard about it. The dead fir it passed at 11 seconds gave him his reference. The top of its head cleared a branch he could later measure at 7 feet 9 inches from the ground. The shoulders were the part that most resisted any effort to file it under something normal. A human being, even a very large one, has shoulders that fit inside a certain range, a range defined by the width of the skeleton beneath them, by the limits of what muscle can do to that frame. These did not fit inside that range. They were impossibly wide, rolling forward slightly with each stride in a way that suggested the whole upper body was built around a different set of proportions entirely. And the arms that hung from them were long in a way that had nothing to do with any human proportion Stellin had a reference for. They swung past the knees in a slow, heavy rhythm, each pendulum arc covering more distance than it should, the kind of rhythm that belongs to something that covers a lot of ground with very little effort, something that has never needed to hurry because hurrying has never been the point. If this forest was its territory, how long had it been watching the machines come through and tear it up? And how long had it been deciding what to do about them? Stellin watched it and noticed where it was going, the staging area. The bulldozer sat at the far edge of the service road where the crew had left it the previous evening, blade down, engine cold, sitting on the same packed gravel it had been sitting on when the operator signed off. The Sasquatch was walking directly toward it, with the same purposeful, unhurried gait it had held since the moment it entered the frame. There was no detour, no hesitation, no slowing to assess the open ground or the unfamiliar terrain of the cleared road. It was walking toward that machine the way a person walks toward something they have already made a decision about. The decision had been made somewhere else before the camera ever picked it up, and what was happening now was simply the execution. The gait was unhurried. That detail landed harder than the size. A Sasquatch that large, moving in the open, along a service road, and there was no urgency in it at all. No scan of the terrain, no checking of angles, none of the low-level alertness that wild animals carry through their bodies even at rest. Why would a wild creature move across an open road without even the smallest trace of caution? Wild animals are always, on some level, listening. Even the ones at the top of the food chain have something residual in them, some background process running beneath behavior, keeping a loose inventory of the environment. Bigfoot had none of that. It moved through the space the way you move through your own house in the dark, unhurried and unafraid, because every part of the space is already known. This was the pace of something that knew exactly where it was going and had no particular reason to rush. At 18 seconds, Bigfoot slowed, just slightly, and its head turned, not toward the camera, toward the staging area ahead, where the machine sat in the fading afternoon light at the edge of the cleared ground. It held that angle for about 2 seconds, then turned back and kept walking. The motion was so specific and so calm that Stellin watched it 3 times before he allowed himself to move on. Not assessment, not curiosity. It already knew the machine was there. The head turn was something else, the particular quality of attention you give to something you have been thinking about for a while and are now almost close enough to reach. Stellin had seen that quality in human subjects on surveillance footage. He had not expected to see it here. At 31 seconds, the service road passed under a gap in the canopy where a large tree had come down at some point, and the wider beam of light that came through that gap caught the hair across Bigfoot's shoulders in detail. Individual strands moved in a faint breeze, each at its own speed, the longer ones catching more air and moving further, the shorter ones barely shifting. It was the movement of real hair on a living body, not costume material, not anything synthetic, but actual biological material, each strand independent, responding to a small amount of air moving through the forest the way any animal's coat would respond to it. Stellin had worked enough wildlife cases to know what hair looked like on a large animal in natural light, and what he was seeing in those 2 seconds matched that in a way that he could not argue himself out of. It kept walking. The bulldozer was visible now at the far right margin of the camera's field. The wide blade, the upper cab structure, the bulk of the machine sitting exactly where the crew had left it. Bigfoot moved into the cleared staging ground, and the camera held its full profile. The cone-shaped skull, the heavy brow ridge above the flat face, the wide shoulders rolling forward in that consistent stride. It was still moving without any change of pace. It had not slowed. It had not stopped to evaluate. Whatever it intended to do when it reached that machine, the decision was already behind it, made and settled somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, not something it was still working out as it crossed the open ground. If the decision had already been made hours earlier, what had convinced it that the bulldozer needed to be dealt with? At 45 seconds, Bigfoot stopped. The stop was total. Not a slow deceleration, not a shift of weight, but an immediate halt, the way a body stops when it has arrived at the thing it came for. It was standing at the front of the bulldozer. The machine came up to roughly its mid-chest. Stellin had the dimensions of a bulldozer memorized from the case file. Operating weight around 20,000 pounds, blade width 14 feet, cab height just under 10 feet to the exhaust stack. He held those numbers in his head and looked at the Sasquatch standing in front of it and felt something happen in the back of his mind that was not comfortable. Then the head turned, not toward the machine, toward the camera. It found the lens with the same precision it had found its destination, directly, without a search, without the half-second of scanning that would have been present if it hadn't already known where to look. Bigfoot's eyes found the lens and held it. How long had it known the camera was there before it decided to look at it? The expression on the face was not what he would have expected. There was no startle in it, no alarm, none of the wide-eye tension that comes through clearly on any large mammal when it encounters something unexpected. The expression was flat, unreadable in the specific way that a face becomes unreadable when the emotion behind it is something unfamiliar. Not the absence of expression, but an expression that had no match in anything Stellin knew how to read. If the creature wasn't surprised by the camera or the machine, then what exactly had it come here expecting to find? If he had to name it, and he resisted doing so, he would have called it acknowledgement. The eye contact lasted 3 seconds. Midway through those 3 seconds, there was a small movement in the irises, a slight shift in the direction of gaze, not dramatic, not a full look away, but the micro-movement that happens when a brain is actively working behind the eyes. Bigfoot was not staring, not frozen, but processing the camera with the same deliberate efficiency it had applied to everything else in its path. Whatever the camera represented, the evaluation was brief. It had been located, classified, and deprioritized in the span of 3 seconds, and then it was simply no longer the focus. That kind of response, finding a thing, deciding about it, continuing, is not the behavior of instinct. Instinct is louder and less precise. What happened at 45 seconds was a decision. After 3 seconds, Bigfoot turned back to the machine. Stellin stayed on the frame, the moment just after the eye contact ended and the Sasquatch turned its attention back to the bulldozer. For a long time, the way you stay on a frame when some part of you is hoping the pause will give the image somewhere else to go. He had reviewed hundreds of hours of trail camera footage over 11 years. He had seen wildlife, vandals, trespassers, livestock. He had a working vocabulary for what human damage looked like and what animal damage looked like and where the boundary between them sat. He had never once, in 11 years, expected to need a category on the other side of both of those things at once. If the answer to the bulldozer damage didn't fit human behavior or animal behavior, what exactly had Stellin been hired to investigate? At 59 seconds, it started. Bigfoot placed both hands against the front blade of the dozer. Not a strike, a placement, deliberate and measured, with the flat of both palms against the upper edge of the steel, fingers curling slightly over the lip. There was no wind-up. There was no gathering of effort, no widening of the stance, no visible bracing. The body didn't shift. It just applied force, and the blade moved. Stellin watched it and thought about the numbers. To move something that heavy from a standing position with no leverage, no running start, no equipment of any kind, through the application of hand pressure alone, he could not finish the calculation in a way that came out as possible. He watched it happen on the screen anyway. The machine rocked backward. Not dramatically, not a catastrophic lurch, a single authoritative rock, the tracks on the far side lifting a few inches off the ground before the weight came back down. The settling impact when it came back down was audible on the microphone. Bigfoot had not moved. Its feet were in the same position. Its posture was the same. It had pushed 20,000 pounds backward a measurable distance without leaning into it, and whatever that had cost it was not visible anywhere on its body. Then it gripped the blade and pulled. The sound the microphone captured at 1 minute and 4 seconds was not a sound Stellin had a reference for. It was metal under stress, the particular dense, tearing quality of structural steel separating at points it was not designed to separate at, layered over a lower, sustained groan that was the frame of the machine responding to a force it had not been engineered to withstand. If the frame of the bulldozer was already failing under the strain, how much more of it could the creature take apart? The blade came away in 2 pieces. The first piece went somewhere to the left, out of frame. The second piece the Sasquatch held in one hand, examined briefly in the way you examine a thing that has just come apart in a manner that surprises you slightly, and then set down on the ground beside the machine with a precision that was almost careful. He replayed those 4 seconds 6 times. What he was looking for, what part of his brain kept insisting had to be there, was some visible exertion in the body, some shift of the hips, some drop of the shoulder, some change of breath visible in the chest or the rib cage. In any large animal under load, you can read the effort. The spine curves toward the resistance. The legs drive into the ground. Something moves that tells you the body is working against something that requires working against. None of that was present. The Sasquatch had removed a steel blade from a 20,000-pound dozer, and the only thing that changed in its body was the position of its arms. Stellin had no explanation for that. He had no framework that could hold it. He just watched it again, and the footage kept showing him the same thing it had shown him every previous time. If the evidence refused to change no matter how many times he replayed it, how was he supposed to explain it to the people who had hired him? He looked at the paused frame on his laptop screen, the machine with its blade gone, the Sasquatch standing beside it with what had been solid welded structural steel lying in two pieces in the gravel, and thought about every equipment damage case he had worked that ended with a clear explanation, and how none of them had pointed anywhere near here. Most equipment damage in wilderness had one of four causes: vandalism, weather, mechanical failure, or transportation accident. He had never once, in 11 years, needed a fifth category. He sat in the truck for probably 2 minutes without moving, and then he started the clip again. Bigfoot moved down the left side of the machine. The same unhurried gait, the same absence of urgency. Walking the length of the dozer the way a person walks the length of something they are inspecting and taking inventory of. At the track assembly, it stopped and crouched, and Stellin lost the upper body to the camera angle. And then there was a sound like a rifle shot, and the camera image shook from the vibration of it, and when the Sasquatch stood back up and kept walking, it was carrying a section of track chain that weighed, by Stellin's later estimate, somewhere between 400 and 500 pounds. It carried it one-handed, the chain hanging in a loose loop from its fist, swinging slightly with each stride in the way things swing when they are being carried by something that does not find their weight particularly notable. It stood at the far end of the machine and held still. It had done something deliberate, and now it was simply standing with the chain at its side, upright and without any shift of weight, in the specific stillness that is different from rest. Not the stillness of something that has stopped because it is tired. The stillness of something that has stopped because it is done with one part and is now considering the next. If this was only one step in a process, what part of the machine would it decide to remove next? The force required to produce what the microphone had captured was not something he could talk himself past. He had worked enough outdoor cases to have a working understanding of what a large body in motion sounds like when it connects with a solid surface, when it bends steel, when it removes load-bearing components from machinery designed to operate in the harshest available terrain. What he had heard from 1 minute and 4 seconds onward was not close to anything a human being was capable of producing without cutting equipment, without time, without preparation of any kind. The effort simply did not register on the Sasquatch's body. Nothing changed in its face. Nothing changed in its posture. It had torn the blade off a 20,000-pound machine and removed a section of track assembly and was now holding 500 pounds of chain in one fist, with the same affect as someone holding a set of car keys. It swung what it had removed as if this required roughly the same amount of attention as opening a door, and then it stood and looked at the rest of the machine, and the expression on its face was the particular blankness of something that is deciding what comes next. If removing a bulldozer blade registered the same way opening a door did, what would actually constitute effort for something like this? The waiting was the part that resisted any clean explanation. This was not random destruction. It was not territorial aggression in any documented form. It was not feeding behavior. It was something that looked, from the outside, like work. A job being done with professional composure, by something that knew exactly what it was doing and had no need to rush through it. Bigfoot had arrived at a specific machine and was working through it with the methodical attention of something that had a clear idea of what it wanted the end state to look like. All of that had the shape of intention, of a plan formed somewhere else in the dark and the quiet of this forest, and now simply being executed one component at a time with no wasted motion and no visible exertion. Stellin had been on enough investigative calls to know the difference between damage caused by force and damage caused by intention. Force leaves patterns that are directional and predictable. The vectors of an impact, the trajectory of a slide, the failure points of metal stressed beyond its rating. Intention leaves patterns that are selective. A machine stripped of specific components, left in a specific condition, arranged in a way that suggests the end state was the objective from the beginning. What Camera 4 had captured had the shape of intention, from the moment the Sasquatch placed its palms against the blade to the moment it stood with the track chain in its fist. And it was the most unsettling thing Stellin had encountered in 11 years of work that occasionally turned up unsettling things. He thought about that while he watched the clip a second time. The components had been removed in a sequence that made a kind of structural sense. The blade first, which bore the weight of the forward end. The track section next, which compromised the machine's mobility. If you wanted to disable a bulldozer permanently, if you wanted to render it irreparable rather than merely inoperative, that was roughly the order in which a knowledgeable person would work. He did not know what to do with the implication of that. He set it to the side and kept watching. If the sequence mirrored how a trained operator would disable a machine, how did the Sasquatch know where to start? At 1 minute and 14 seconds, the tree line on the far side of the staging area moved. Not the way wind moves a tree line, not a general wave-like shift of branches and upper canopy. The movement was low and specific, the kind that comes from a large body pushing through dense brush, and it happened at a single point in the tree line directly across the staging area from where Bigfoot stood. A second Sasquatch stepped out. Stellin's first impression was size, and his second impression was that his first impression had been wrong because he had used the first Bigfoot as his baseline for large. The second Sasquatch was bigger, noticeably, significantly bigger. He estimated somewhere between 9.5 and 10 feet, broader across the chest and shoulders, the coat darker, almost black in the shadows at the edge of the staging area, and shifting toward a very deep brown, only when it moved far enough into the light. Each step carried a mass that was visible in the way the ground responded, in the way the gravel compressed and shifted with each footfall. If the first one had already dismantled part of the machine alone, what could the larger one do when it reached it? It moved directly to the dozer cab. No inspection, no pause. It gripped the cab structure at the roofline with both hands, and what it did next happened in the same quiet, businesslike way everything had happened since the first Bigfoot walked into frame. The cab came off the frame, not twisted, not folded, separated cleanly at the mounting points, lifted away from the machine as a unit, and set down on the far side of the clearing with the same considered placement the first Sasquatch had used when it set down the blade section. The roll cage was still intact, the seat was still inside it. The whole assembly sat upright on the gravel, and the machine beneath it was open to the sky, its internal workings exposed to the forest air, as if the cab had simply been removed for maintenance by someone who knew exactly which bolts to pull. The two Sasquatches stood in the staging area and faced what remained of the dozer. There was no sound between them on the microphone, no vocalization, no clicking, no signal of any kind. They stood in the remaining light with the stripped machine between them, and they were still, and whatever was happening between them did not require sound. If they weren't communicating out loud, how had they coordinated the work so precisely? Then the larger one looked up. It found the camera immediately. The head came up, and the eyes went directly to the lens without a scan, without a search, without the delay that would have been present if it didn't already know where to look. It held eye contact for 3 seconds, the same duration as the first Sasquatch, and the expression Stellin saw on its face across that brief span of footage was not curiosity. It was not alarm. It was something that he kept turning over in his mind on the drive back south and could not find a better word for than acknowledgement. Not surprise that the camera was there, not aggression toward it. Something closer to the look a person gives when they notice they are being watched and want you to know they noticed. The clip ended. 99 seconds of footage, and Stellin had no idea what to do with any of it. If the creatures knew they were being watched, had the camera captured exactly what they wanted someone to see? The Halverson equipment had been at that site for 3 weeks. Whatever had been decided about it had been decided somewhere in that window, in the old-growth forest above the staging area, in the dark, with no documentation of any kind, No record of the deliberation, no way to read the outcome, until Camera 4 picked up the result in 1 minute and 39 seconds of footage. This was not a territorial behavior that happened to be caught on camera. It was a territorial behavior that was delivered to one. They had not been surprised by his equipment. They had used it. The destruction was not something that Stellin's investigation had uncovered. It was something that had been staged for his investigation, or for whoever came after him, or for the footage to eventually reach whoever at the Halverson Timber Company had the authority to decide whether the machines went back in.
Kevin had spent the better part of 4 years building a reputation as one of the more meticulous wildlife documentarians working the Pacific Northwest. At 38, he operated out of Portland, Oregon, with the kind of patience that most filmmakers his age had already given up on. For this particular project, Kevin deployed 12 motion-activated cameras across a 20-square-mile section of Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. All 12 were Reconyx models, angled to capture movement along game trails and natural feeding clearings. Camera 4 was the one that really mattered. Kevin had positioned it near a dense huckleberry patch in a remote valley, approximately 9 miles from the nearest Forest Service road. Getting there required a full day's hike with equipment on both legs of the trip. But that's when everything changed. High on a Douglas fir approximately 15 feet from camera number 4's mounting tree, there were fresh scratches in the bark. Deep ones. They ran in parallel lines from roughly 9 feet off the ground up to about 12 feet, suggesting something had raked downward with significant force. Kevin photographed them and noted they were too high and too deep to be consistent with any black bear in the area. Black bears scratch trees as a form of communication. They rear up on their hind legs and mark at the upper limit of their reach. The tallest bear Kevin had documented in this section was a male he estimated at around 400 pounds, capable of reaching about 7 feet standing upright. These scratches started at 9 feet. Whatever made them was reaching above the height of the largest known bear in the study area. Kevin flagged it in his log and left. On June 3, 2014, Kevin made his final equipment check at camera number 4 before leaving the area. He spent several hours adjusting the angle and recalibrating the motion sensors. He noted in his field log that the berries were ripening faster than expected. He noted that peak bear activity was probably 2 to 3 weeks out. He also noted something that didn't belong. The timestamp reads 3:47 p.m., August 28, 2014. The footage opens on a scene so ordinary it barely warrants description. A large male black bear enters the frame from the left, moving towards the huckleberry patch with the unhurried, methodical gait of an animal completely at ease in its environment. Based on comparison to the alder saplings at the right edge of the frame, whose heights Kevin had documented during setup, the bear weighs approximately 350 pounds. It's in peak late summer condition, dense and heavy-shouldered, moving with the kind of settled confidence that comes from weeks of undisturbed feeding at the same location. It drops its head and begins stripping berries. The bear feeds without interruption for 23 seconds. At the 0:23 mark, something shifts. Not in the clearing, in the bear. Its head comes up in a single frame, ears rigid, body locked. It backs 2 steps away from the berry patch. The camera's built-in microphone picks up a low huffing sound, the warning vocalization that black bears produce when they detect something large enough to pose a genuine threat. Not deer, not smaller predators, something the bear's instincts have registered as dangerous before its eyes have found it. The bear rises onto its hind legs at 0:28, reaching approximately 6 feet tall, and scans the tree line at the clearing's far edge. It holds that position for 3 full seconds. At 0:31, Bigfoot steps out of the forest. It doesn't ease into the clearing. It doesn't pause at the tree line. It walks into the open at full height and stops. Later analysis placed the creature at approximately 8.5 feet tall, using the alder saplings and the bear's estimated size as reference points. Weight estimates based on proportion and build ranged from 700 to 800 pounds. The hair covering its body is dark brown, dense, visibly matted in the way hair gets when it's exposed to forest conditions over long periods. Not groomed, not maintained, just grown. There is a lighter coloring across the chest and upper abdomen. The arms are long enough that the hands hang past the knees when relaxed. Each finger is individually visible in the 1080p resolution. The shoulders are wide enough that the frame barely contains them. The face is the part that stopped researchers. A flat nose, wide nostrils, a heavy brow ridge that throws the eyes into shadow. The expression, and every researcher who viewed this footage used that word without being asked to, is not neutral. Lips slightly parted, the jaw set. The eyes on the bear have a quality that a forensic behavioral analyst described in his written assessment as resolved. Not threatening, not displaying, already past that stage. Bigfoot has already decided what will happen. The bear has not run. This detail matters. A 350-pound adult male black bear is not prey. It is one of the apex predators of the Pacific Northwest, capable of driving off mountain lions and holding territory against anything in the regional ecosystem. When black bears encounter threats, they assess the situation. This one assesses for 4 full seconds, while Bigfoot stands motionless at the clearing's edge. And then the bear does something that no wildlife biologist watching this footage expected. It holds its ground. It stays on its hind legs. It huffs again, louder this time, audible on the recording even over the ambient forest noise. Bigfoot doesn't respond. It doesn't posture. It doesn't vocalize. It stands completely still and watches the bear with the same expression it had when it entered the clearing. The stillness lasts 9 seconds. 9 seconds of a 350-pound bear and an 800-pound unknown creature locked in a standoff in a forest clearing that nobody was supposed to be watching. And then Bigfoot takes the first step forward. The approach is not a charge. Not yet. Bigfoot moves across the clearing in a slow, deliberate walk that covers ground without urgency, the kind of movement that communicates something more unsettling than speed. Speed would mean adrenaline. Speed would mean reactivity. This is neither. This is something walking toward a confrontation that it considers already settled. At 0:41, when Bigfoot has closed the distance to approximately 15 feet, the bear drops back to all fours. Standard territorial behavior, dropping to all fours before a charge or a retreat, loading the hindquarters for explosive movement in either direction. The bear's head is low, ears back. It huffs 3 times in rapid succession. Bigfoot stops walking at 12 feet. It stands and looks at the bear. What follows is 14 seconds of footage that forensic behavioral analysts have returned to repeatedly because it doesn't fit any predator-prey interaction template in the database. Bigfoot is not circling. It is not fainting. It is standing 12 feet from a 350-pound bear that is visibly preparing to either charge or flee, and it is simply waiting. The bear's head swings left and right, looking for an exit route, evaluating angles. Bigfoot's head doesn't move. Its eyes track the bear's movement without the head following. The eyes move within the skull, while the face stays forward. The behavior of an animal watching something it expects to be in a specific place when the time comes. At 0:55, the bear makes its decision. It launches forward, a black bear charge, low and fast, covering ground with the explosive acceleration that makes these animals genuinely dangerous. A charging 350-pound black bear hits with enough force to knock a grown person 20 feet. It covers the 12 feet between them in under a second. Bigfoot sidesteps, not backward, not a retreat. A single lateral step to the right that takes it outside the bear's charge line. And as the bear passes, Bigfoot's left hand comes down across the back of the bear's neck. Not a full strike, an open palm push that redirects the bear's momentum and sends it stumbling past, losing its footing on the turn and going down on one knee before scrambling back upright. The bear spins to face Bigfoot again, its breathing hard, audible on the recording. The charge cost it something. Bigfoot is in the same place it was before the step, facing the bear, completely unruffled. The footage shows Bigfoot's posture at this moment with unusual clarity, still upright, arms loose at its sides, head level. It hasn't widened its stance. It hasn't raised its hands. It didn't need to. A 350-pound black bear charged it at full speed, and Bigfoot took one step to the side and redirected it with an open palm. The bear is already bleeding and catching its breath. Bigfoot looks like it hasn't moved at all. For 3 seconds, neither animal moves. the bear at one side of the clearing, Bigfoot at the center, the huckleberry patch behind it untouched. Then the bear drops lower, shifts its weight to its hindquarters, and comes again. The bear charges again at 104, lower this time, faster, angling from the right. Bigfoot doesn't sidestep. It takes one step forward into the charge, directly into the bear's path, and catches the animal by the shoulder with one hand, absorbing the impact without moving, stopping 350 pounds of full-speed black bear with a single outstretched arm. The bear's momentum simply ceases. Its legs scramble against the ground and find no purchase. For 2 full seconds, the recording shows Bigfoot holding a charging black bear at arm's length, while the animal's hind legs work uselessly against the earth. The bear doesn't stop trying. That's the part the footage makes clear. While it's suspended at arm's length, feet off the ground, all forward momentum gone, it twists its neck and bites down on Bigfoot's extended forearm. The bite is visible on the recording. The bear locks its jaws and wrenches sideways, the way bears break limbs and uproot stumps. Bigfoot's arm does not move. The grip on the shoulder does not release. For a full second, a 350-pound black bear is biting down with everything it has on an arm that does not react. Then Bigfoot releases it. The bear stumbles back, shaking its head. It is bleeding now, somewhere around the left ear, a dark line visible in the footage. It didn't get that from Bigfoot's hand. It got it from the impact, from hitting something that simply didn't give. The clearing is quiet for 6 seconds. At 112, something in the bear's posture changes. The aggression has not left. The ears are still back, the head still low, but there is a new quality in its movement, something tighter and less committed. The bear circles left, staying at roughly 10 feet, watching Bigfoot's hands. Bigfoot pivots to track it, still standing straight, still unhurried. The bear circles right. Bigfoot pivots again. This continues for 47 seconds. What the footage shows for the next 47 seconds is one of the most analytically unusual sequences in the entire recording. The bear circles at a consistent radius, probing. It accelerates, then slows. It feints left, recovers, feints right. Each movement is met with nothing more than a pivot from Bigfoot, keeping its front oriented toward the bear, hands loose at its sides. 3 times during the circle, the bear makes short, partial lunges, not full charges, to test responses. Each time, Bigfoot moves into the lunge rather than back from it, one hand coming forward as a block or redirect. The contact brief and controlled. After the 3rd lunge, the bear retreats to 15 feet and stops circling. There is a 4th exchange that researchers note separately. At approximately 1:43, the bear stops circling and stands still 10 feet away, facing Bigfoot directly. It holds that position for 4 seconds, the longest it has been completely motionless since Bigfoot entered the clearing. Then it rises onto its hind legs again, the same posture as 028, the same attempt to make itself large, the same forepaws up. It is taller than most predators it has encountered in this forest. It is 6 feet tall and 350 pounds, out of options, and trying the thing that has worked on everything else. Bigfoot watches it from 10 feet away without changing its expression. The bear holds the posture for 3 seconds. Then it drops back to all fours, backs 2 steps, and makes the low, sustained moan that comes next. At 1:59, the bear does something that wildlife biologists reviewing this footage noted as genuinely unusual. It vocalizes, not a huff, but a longer, lower sound. The kind of sustained moan that black bears produce in situations of extreme stress. It is not a combat sound. It is closer to what researchers describe as a distress call, the kind of sound bears make when they are injured or cornered. The bear is neither injured enough to justify that vocalization, nor cornered in any physical sense. The clearing has open exits in 3 directions. The bear is making that sound because of what it is standing 15 feet from. Bigfoot doesn't react to the sound. It doesn't move toward the bear. It doesn't move away. It stands at the center of the clearing with the same quality of settled stillness it has maintained since it stopped walking at 0:41. And it watches the bear produce a sound that, in over 4 years of footage, Kevin had never once recorded a black bear making in an open clearing with multiple escape routes available. At 2:14, the bear tries to leave. It turns away from Bigfoot and moves toward the tree line at the clearing's south edge, low and fast, not quite running. The exit is 30 feet away. Open ground, no obstacles. 3 seconds at the bear's current speed, and it reaches cover. And for 3 seconds that researchers have flagged in every analysis of this footage, Bigfoot simply watches it go. The bear covers 8 feet before Bigfoot moves. Then it moves. At 2:17, Bigfoot covers the distance to the retreating bear in 4 strides, not at full speed, deliberately. The bear hears it coming and tries to accelerate toward the tree line, and Bigfoot cuts left, angles ahead of the bear's path, and stops directly between the bear and the forest exit. The bear pulls up short. It is now 8 feet from Bigfoot and approximately 25 feet from the nearest tree line. It turns and looks for another exit. Bigfoot watches it look. When the bear begins moving toward the east edge of the clearing, Bigfoot moves first, cutting that angle too, positioning again between the bear and the trees. This happens 4 times in 38 seconds. Each time, the pattern is the same. The bear picks an angle toward the tree line, south edge, east edge, a gap between 2 large firs at the northwest corner, and begins moving. Each time, Bigfoot is already there before the bear arrives. Not running, not scrambling, moving at a pace that shouldn't be fast enough to cut off a bear at full acceleration, but arriving first regardless. On the 3rd attempt, the bear gets within 6 feet of the tree line before Bigfoot steps into the gap. On the 4th attempt, it doesn't get that far. By the 5th, the bear doesn't pick a direction at all. It slows to a stop at the center of the clearing and stands there. By 2:55, the bear has stopped trying to reach the tree line. It is standing at the center of the clearing, where Bigfoot has herded it, turning in slow circles. Its breathing is audible on the recording. It is not badly injured. The cut near its ear is minor, and the stumbles from the earlier exchanges left nothing visible. But it has been outmaneuvered 4 times in under a minute by something that never appeared to hurry, and it has run out of angles. Bigfoot has been guiding the bear toward the center of the clearing with the same calm deliberateness it has shown since it entered the frame. Not pursuing, not attacking. Positioning. The bear stands in the open at the center of the clearing, and Bigfoot stands between it and every exit, and for 22 seconds, nothing moves at all. The bear is 9 feet from Bigfoot. Bigfoot is standing with its arms at its sides. The bear's ears are flat, its head low, its weight settled over its hindquarters. It is ready to charge or ready to run. Both options are available in its body, loaded and waiting for the decision. What is not available, and what the bear seems to be processing for the first time in the footage, is a path that doesn't go through the thing standing in front of it. At 3:14, the bear's head moves, not toward Bigfoot, sideways, scanning the tree line to the east one more time. The gap between the 2 large firs at the northwest corner, the south edge, back to Bigfoot. The scan takes 4 seconds and finds nothing new. Bigfoot blocked all of those angles already and is standing between the bear and every one of them. The bear's head comes back to the center, to Bigfoot. 3 seconds of absolute stillness. Then the bear charges. At 3:17, it lowers its head and goes straight at Bigfoot. Not for the tree line, not angled, just directly forward at full speed with everything it has left. Bigfoot takes 1 step back to absorb the incoming force and catches the bear by both shoulders as it arrives. The impact is audible on the recording, the heaviest sound in the entire 5-minute clip, louder than the earlier exchanges. A collision between 350 pounds of forward momentum and something that doesn't move. The bear's legs keep churning for 2 full seconds, going nowhere, while Bigfoot holds it at full extension, both hands locked on the animal's shoulders, looking down at it. The bear bites again. Same thing it tried at 1:04, jaws locking on Bigfoot's right forearm, full force, twisting. The bite holds for 2 seconds. The arm doesn't move. Bigfoot looks down at it, the way you might look at something pulling on your sleeve. Then Bigfoot lifts the bear off the ground and holds it there, all 4 paws off the earth, dangling, for a full 3 seconds. The camera is close enough that individual muscles are visible moving under the hair of Bigfoot's forearms as it holds the weight. The bear makes no sound. It has gone from the loudest and most aggressive animal in this forest to completely silent in under 4 minutes. Bigfoot carries it to the center of the clearing. At 3:34, it sets the bear down on its feet, releases it, steps back, The bear lands on all fours. It takes one stumbling step sideways to regain its balance, then goes still. It does not immediately try to run. It does not charge. Its head is up, breathing loud enough to pick up on the recording, the cut near its ear still visible. It is looking at Bigfoot with the same fixed attention it has had since 031, but there is nothing in that attention now that resembles the aggression from the first two charges. The behavioral analyst who reviewed the footage described the bear's posture at 3:34 as orientation without intent. The body pointed toward the threat. No commitment behind it. Bigfoot stands 2 feet away and looks back at it for 4 seconds. Then it turns and walks to the berry patch. The bear does not run. It stands where Bigfoot placed it, breathing hard, head low. It doesn't attempt another exit. It doesn't charge. Whatever the last 4 minutes have communicated, the bear has received the message. It stands in the open at the center of the clearing, and it waits. And Bigfoot walks back to the huckleberry patch and begins feeding. For the next 97 seconds, from 3:34 to 5:11, the camera records Bigfoot feeding and the bear standing motionless in the center of the clearing, watching it. Bigfoot strips berries methodically, covering the patch in the same systematic route the bear had been using before the standoff began. It moves without hurry. Occasionally, it glances at the bear, not with threat, not with monitoring attention, with the glance of something checking on something it has put somewhere. At 4:02, the bear takes one step toward the tree line. Just one. It stops. Bigfoot doesn't look up from the berry patch. It keeps feeding. The bear holds its position for 11 seconds, then steps back to where it was. At 4:19, the bear takes 2 steps in a different direction, toward the north edge of the clearing. It stops again. Bigfoot still doesn't look up. The bear watches Bigfoot's back for 8 seconds, assessing whether the inattention is real or a trap. Then it steps back. It doesn't try again after that. The bear does not leave. It stands in the open and watches a creature it cannot fight, feeding on berries it had arrived to claim for itself, and does not move. At 5:04, Bigfoot finishes the eastern edge of the patch. It pauses. It looks at the bear for the first time, with the same expression it entered the clearing with, that resolved, settled quality that researchers kept returning to when describing the face at 031. What happens next is what the footage is named for. It is the last 7 seconds of the recording. It is the darkest thing ever documented on a wildlife camera in the Pacific Northwest. And it is the reason Kevin watched this clip 6 times in a row before he took his pack off. At 5:05, Bigfoot moves toward the bear, not walking this time, not the deliberate, calculated approach from the beginning. 3 fast strides that close the remaining distance in under 2 seconds. The bear has been watching Bigfoot feed for 97 seconds. It has seen Bigfoot's back. It has tested the gaps twice and found nothing. When Bigfoot turns and moves, the bear has less than 2 seconds to process the change before the distance is gone. The bear doesn't run. It hasn't had a plan that worked yet, and it has nowhere left to go. And it has been standing in the open for 97 seconds, absorbing whatever the last 4 minutes have meant to its instincts. It does the only thing left. It rises on its hind legs, full height, the same defensive posture it tried at the very beginning when Bigfoot first emerged from the tree line, 6 feet tall, 4 paws raised, making itself as large as it can be. Bigfoot grabs it by the throat with one hand. The grip is immediate and complete, one hand closing around the bear's neck while it is still rising, stopping the movement entirely. Bigfoot's arm is fully extended. The bear is off the ground with its hind legs, scrambling in the air. It lasted this long. It survived the charges, survived being held at arm's length, survived being lifted and set back down, survived 97 seconds of standing in the open while the thing that herded it there ate berries. It is still fighting. It rakes Bigfoot's forearm with both sets of claws, audible on the recording, 4 rapid impacts that tear through the hair and leave marks visible in the frame. And Bigfoot does not release the grip. The arm doesn't bend. It doesn't shift. The individual muscles visible beneath the hair of that extended forearm don't change. Holding 350 pounds at arm's length with one hand, with a bear actively tearing at the skin, is something no known primate and no known predator in the Pacific Northwest can do. Bigfoot does it for 3 seconds without visible effort. At 5:08, Bigfoot drives the bear into the ground face first, with enough force to send a visible plume of dust and debris up into the frame. The sound it makes is the loudest thing on the recording by a significant margin. The bear does not get up. What follows in the final seconds of footage is the detail that caused multiple researchers to turn off the recording before it finished. Bigfoot drops to one knee over the bear. The feeding that follows is immediate and methodical, and it does not stop before the recording ends. The creature that spent 4 minutes herding this bear to the center of a clearing, that held it off the ground with one hand and set it back down, and then fed peacefully for 97 seconds before deciding the time had arrived. The total footage was 5 minutes and 11 seconds. Kevin retrieved camera number 4's memory card on September 4th, 2014, during a routine maintenance sweep. He watched the footage 6 times, standing in the forest. His field notes from that afternoon are 4 lines long. He wrote that he didn't know how to categorize what he had filmed, and that he needed to hike to camera number 4's position before leaving. He did. The bear's carcass was still partially at the site, scavenged in the week since its death, but identifiable by size and positioned where the footage showed it had ended up. Kevin returned to that location a year later. He found new scratch marks on the same Douglas fir, higher than before, reaching 14 feet, requiring an extension that exceeded even the creature's documented height. Made exactly 1 year after the attack, at the same tree, in the same pattern. Bigfoot was still alive.